Speed Week in Daytona just culminated a week ago today when Denny Hamlin won the Daytona 500 with an average speed of 158 miles an hour. I think we have a picture of him up here. Let's see if there he is. Denny Hamlin is in the number 11 car. Now, what you may not know is that the number 78 car, that was driven by Adele Barber. Did you know that? Just that close, Adele. You'll get them next year, though, okay? So she goes 158 in our parking lot, so this was easy for her. Americans love speed. We have a need for speed. So Speed Week was just about an hour north of here, boy. It was perfect, going faster than ever. And next year they'll go faster than this. There's a man named James Gleick. He wrote a book, and the title of the book is just 4 letters. It's written like one of those vanity license plates where it says FSTR, and of course you pronounce it faster, but he didn't have time to put the vowels in, so he just put FSTR on that. The subtitle of his book says, The Acceleration of Just About Everything. He talks in there about how everything has gotten faster. In our society, it's all about speed and getting faster at everything. So he says, we've gotten faster at travel and cooking, communication, and commerce. Everything gets faster. We pay with debit cards. We go through the line and we pay. We used to swipe it and enter a passcode, and that could take 15 seconds. So we got to make that faster. So now you'll just be able to tap it when you go, and pretty soon you won't have to even stop. You won't even have to slow down. You just run through full speed. You've seen the commercial where people are in line and people are paying with their debit cards, and it's really fast. And then somebody pulls out cash, and everybody in line groans like, oh, no, now they're going to have to get change. We're going to be here for like an extra 30 seconds. What are we going to do? In our society, we just have to have speed, more speed, more speed. The Hitachi Corporation's chairman, a man named Dan Hancock, he says, speed is God and time is the devil. The whole idea in corporations today is to shrink time down and increase the speed because speed is God. Everything is designed for speed. But what's happened in science and in industry has also entered into the whole domestic world in which many of us live. So we like quick service. We like instant popcorn. We like fast lanes. We like blazing internet speeds. Just to show you how I fall into this just like everybody else, this past week I had to laugh at myself because I was actually working on this sermon about slowing down. And I was so frustrated with my computer because it wasn't going fast enough. And I wanted to go faster and faster. And then as I realized what I was writing about, what I'm preaching about, I had to laugh at myself because I'm caught up in the same thing. We get so frustrated if our computer just delays for a few seconds. Bill Hybels, a pastor up in Illinois, told a story about visiting friends in Germany. And he had always wanted to drive on the Autobahn in Germany where there's no speed limits. And his friends had a brand new Mercedes. And at the end of their visit, they had to drive about an hour to the airport on the Autobahn. And they asked Bill if he wanted to drive the Mercedes. And he was thrilled. So he got into the car and he said they were making their way to the Autobahn. And he was having this really wonderful conversation with his friends. And then he gets onto the Autobahn and he starts to accelerate. And he's watching the needle go to 80, 90, 100, 110. He said what happened, though, in the car is the conversation just ceased because all the focus was on driving, keeping that car on the road as the trees are just passing by at lightning speeds. And he realized afterwards, he said, that's kind of what happens in our life. If you're going along at a relaxed pace, you can have conversations. You can focus on people. But as the pace of life gets faster and faster and faster, all the focus on human beings ends, and it's just all about speed and all about going faster and faster. We can drive down life's road so quickly that we miss the beauty of the people in the world around us. Somewhere along the line in my lifetime, being busy became a badge of honor. I think I've told you about a sermon I read when I first became a pastor of a church. It was called The Myth of the Busy Pastor. And it talked about how pastors love to portray themselves as being busy because there's sort of we equate busy with important. I must be busy because I'm so important, I have so many important things to do, that we convey that to people, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. And one of the ways that you know that you've done that is when people start all of their conversations, if they call on the phone, and they start all their conversations by saying, I won't take too long because I know you're really busy. Some of you have said that to me, haven't you? You know, and I know you're trying to be polite, but when you say that, I think, what's gone wrong here? How have I conveyed that I'm too busy to have a conversation? But a lot of people do that. It's not just pastors. A lot of people in their kind of self-importance think that they're just too busy to stop to do other things. Somehow we have to get away from that. Because one of the things I notice when I read through the Scriptures is I never see Jesus in a hurry. Can you think of any time in the Scriptures when Jesus was in a hurry? You know, he only had 3 years in public ministry to accomplish the most important task ever, and yet he was never in a hurry. Even when his dear friends, Martha and Mary, contacted him and they said, "Our brother is dying, please get here quickly," Jesus didn't hurry. Took him a couple of days to get to where they were. He was never in a hurry because he was always in control. He always knew what was going to happen. Today we're going to look at a passage of Scripture where Jesus is passing through Jericho. And just to give you some background on that, I want you to know that Jericho is one of the fastest moving, the most commercially oriented cities of the day when Jesus was there. It was sort of the New York City of Palestine. And he's passing through Jericho. And there's crowds, as you'll see when we read this, there's crowds on both sides. They are clamoring for his attention. And it's not as if he has nowhere to go. When he's passing through Jericho, he's actually on his way to Jerusalem to the cross. And so I think people would easily excuse him if he was a bit distracted and didn't have time for conversation on that day, considering where he was going. But I want you to notice what Jesus does in this most busy moment of his life here. Look, we're going to look at Luke 19, the first 10 verses. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see Jesus, who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. If we could pause for just a second. I know we're in a hurry to get through this, but just let me pause briefly. Jesus did something amazing right there. What he did that was so amazing was he stopped. You know, he's moving through, and it's kind of like at parade speed. The crowds were so thick that this man Zacchaeus couldn't see him. So if you've ever seen the Macy's Day Parade, for example, in New York City, where the crowds can be like 10 deep, and if you're not about 6'10", you can't see anything because you're back behind. All you see are the backs of other people. So the crowds were very thick. There were a lot of people that came out to see Jesus. His reputation had spread, and people were just flocking to him. And you know that they were clamoring to him, but he was moving along at parade speed here. And if you've seen the politicians when they film them going through the crowds, the politicians have this policy that they're going through and they're shaking hands. They look people in the eye to really act interested. Key word being act. They really try to convince you that they really care about you. They look you in the eye, they shake your hand, they kiss the babies, but they always keep moving. They have handlers around them who have a schedule, and they know they've got to get to the next point, and they've got a certain amount of time to get through the crowd. So what you cannot do is stop. You got to keep moving, shake the hands, but keep moving, keep moving. And here Jesus is moving through this crowd on his way to Jerusalem, crowds everywhere, and all of a sudden he stops. It's amazing. He stops. He stops because of one person. It was unscheduled. It was unplanned. It said he was passing through Jericho. He wasn't there for this meeting with Zacchaeus. This was unscheduled. It was unplanned. It was a spontaneous change in his plans. He said, I must stay at your house today. He decided in an instant that was the most important thing for him to do. Most people would have missed that moment. They would have never spotted the little man in the tree because they would have been so absorbed with their own plans and so much in a hurry to get to the next thing. So Jesus sees the least liked person in all of Jericho. He was not only was a tax collector, he was the chief tax collector. These were people who collected taxes for the Romans, and they ripped off their fellow Jews by taking money for themselves. And it was just part of the job to rip off the people. So the people of Israel hated tax collectors, and the one they hated the most was the chief tax collector. So Jesus spots the one person in town who is the most despised in the entire town, and he picks him out of the crowd. You know, if Jesus had handlers like politicians, they would not have been happy with this. They would have told him, don't go to that guy's house. That is going to cost you some votes. Jesus didn't care about the votes. He cared about a man's soul. So I want you to look at the reaction of the crowd in verse 7. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he is gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up. This was back in his house after they had been together. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. After that visit with Jesus, Zacchaeus was forever changed. You know, Christianity, we've said before, it's not a religion, it's a relationship with a living God. And the relationship with a living God is about transformation, to change us to where the old is gone and you become an entirely new person. And that happened to Zacchaeus in this brief encounter with Jesus Christ. He was a cheater, and he became a man of integrity. He was a totally self-centered person, and he began focused on others. He was greedy, and he became generous. He was completely transformed by this encounter with Jesus Christ. So Jesus says to him in verse 9, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. That's his purpose statement. I don't know if you know that. Jesus was able to state his reason for coming to this earth in one sentence, and he never used a single word that was more than one syllable. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. He knows why he was here, and that's what he was doing at the house of Zacchaeus. Jesus was headed to Jerusalem, and he was headed for the cross. He had a lot on his mind. There were crowds clamoring for his attention. There must have been so many fascinating things that would have caught my eye, that would catch your eye as you're going through this crowd with going through this town with all of these crowds and all of these people. And all of this was swirling around him. So how in the world did Jesus ever spot that one little man up in the tree? How did he do that? With all of the demands upon him to go faster and faster and faster, how did he ever slow down? How did he manage to stop everything and just take the whole day and go have lunch with this total stranger who was so despised by everybody else? The thing about Jesus is this wasn't the only time he did this. He did this over and over and over. We can go through the scriptures and read the accounts of various individuals that he would meet, and when he would meet them, he would stop and he would have substantive conversations with them, life-changing conversations, because he wasn't in a hurry to get to the next place. He had time for every individual that he met. And the real question for me is, how can we learn to do this? How can we learn to slow our lives down so that we see people, not just see them in a blur as we go flying past them, but we see their face and we see the pain that they have, and we can have conversations and we can connect with them, and hopefully we can even bring them to know Jesus. John Ortberg once asked this very wise mentor of his what was the most important thing that he could do if he wanted to live a healthy Christian life. And the older man said this to him. He said, "The chief enemy of the spiritual life is hurry." I want you to think about that. I mean, you've heard all kinds of sermons on sin and all kinds of other reasons, things that you believe are your enemy, where Satan is our enemy and all these other things. But think about this for just a moment. The chief enemy of the spiritual life is hurry. Think about how that can rob you of your time alone with God. It can rob you of your ministry time with people who really need it. It's perfect strategy for Satan, isn't it? If he can wind you up and get you going 100 miles an hour through the day, you're not going to be any good to anybody. And you're not going to last long for God either. I think it's a good statement. The chief enemy of the spiritual life is hurry. And then he gave him this advice. He said, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. What would that look like in your life? If you set out today, tomorrow, this week, to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. What are the moments and the times in your day when you're rushing, when you're really in a hurry? What would it look like if you eliminated those times? My grandfather had a sign on his desk at work. It wasn't very good grammar, but it was good advice. He said, "The hurrier I go, the behinder I get." Have you ever felt that way? You know, you're rushing and you're rushing and you're rushing, but when you're rushing, you're not very efficient because your mind isn't clear. You make a lot of mistakes. You have to go back for things that you forgot, and you just end up, instead of getting ahead with all of your to-do list, you get farther and farther behind. There were a lot of voices, I'm sure, that were urging Jesus to go faster, urging him to get through that crowd, to get through Jericho. We got to get to Jerusalem. There's important things here. I'm sure there were a lot of voices pushing him faster, but the voice of God told the Son of God to slow down. And Jesus listened to the voice of his Father, and he actually stopped. He looks up into a sycamore tree, and he sees this man named Zacchaeus, and that became the turning point in that man's life, because Jesus was simply able to stop, and that turned that man's life around. You know, we've been talking about loving our neighbor here for quite a while now, all year. We can't love our neighbor if we go flying past him at 100 miles an hour. That's why the Good Samaritan is riding on a donkey, not a Ferrari. Well, also because Ferraris hadn't been invented. But if they had been, he would never have helped that man if he'd gone by at 100 miles an hour. If we're going to be that way, we have to slow down. Here's the secret. I'm going to tell you what the secret is to slowing your life down. And it's right from the life of Christ. My question is, how did Jesus do that? And the answer is, he trained for that moment. You know, every week, Jesus practiced the Sabbath rest. No matter how busy he was, when it came time for the Sabbath, he stopped all activities as God commanded in the Ten Commandments, ceased all other activities, and rested. And it wasn't just to sleep all day, but it was to focus his attention on God. And he did that every single week. But not only did he make that a weekly habit in his life, but he had a daily habit of slipping away from the crowd and spending time with his Father. Whenever the disciples couldn't find him, when the people were coming to him, they wanted to be healed, they wanted demons cast out, they wanted to hear him teach, they knew where to find him. They'd go up into the mountain, and they'd go up into these quiet places, and they would find him praying up there. Sometimes he spent all night praying to his Father. So he practiced, he trained for this of being still in the presence of his Father and slowing down. He wasn't too busy to pray. I think for most of us, that's where we get into trouble. When we get busier and busier, the urgent things crowd out the important things. Prayer is more important than anything else on our schedule, but it's not urgent. We can do that later on in the day. We can do that tomorrow. So the urgent things keep pushing it off of our schedule and keep pushing it farther and farther away. And so pretty soon the time where we're being still before the Father is stopped. And when we're not spending that time alone with God and being quiet and being still, our heart just races and our schedule races, and we have no ability to slow down. Jesus never lost that ability because he trained for it every day. Many of you have plans to exercise physically, to watch what you eat so you stay in shape physically. What is your plan spiritually? To be strong spiritually, to finish the race. What is your plan in place? For Jesus, it was daily time with his Father, and it was weekly time of the Sabbath rest. What is your spiritual plan to stay strong? How do you practice being still and listening to God's still, small voice? Years ago, I was reading a book about spiritual disciplines, and one of the chapters was a spiritual discipline that I had never heard anybody talk about before. It was the discipline of silence. You ever hear a message on that? I hear messages on fasting and praying and giving and all kinds of spiritual disciplines. But I don't think I'd ever heard a message on silence, the importance of silence. And I believe that's the essence of what the Bible is saying when it says, be still and know that I am God. We have to quiet that voice that's racing in our head, all of that conversation. We have to get away from all of the noise around us if we're going to ever hear God's still, small voice speak to our hearts. So I would urge you to train for those moments by practicing the spiritual discipline of silence and listening to God. I mentioned Bill Hybels before. He was the one who was driving on the Autobahn at 110. He also told a story about walking through his church up in Illinois. Big church, he's pastor of one of the largest churches in the country, and it was a big facility. And he was leaving his office, and he had to meet with some of the church leaders in a conference room that was kind of on the opposite side of the church. And he had left it a little bit late, so he said he was half walking, half running down the hallways of his church. And there was one of the workers there who was cleaning a window. And he saw the man, and as he's walking, he was watching the man. And he said the man was moving so slowly cleaning the window that he looked like he thought the window was winning, is how he put it. When he got closer, he did a quick glance at the man's face, and he had planned to just go by and say, "Hi, how you doing? Great to see you," and just keep flying, stick and move, as I said. But he looked at the man's face, and the man's face just was so sad. He knew that this man was deeply troubled. He could see it in an instant. And he had this moment of wrestling inside of him where he says, "I've got to get to the meeting. I've got to get to the meeting." And so he just sort of said to the man, "How you doing?" He was kind of hoping for fine, and then he was going to say, "Great, good to see you," and he was going to go. But the man just looked at him. And he said the expression on his face kind of implied, "I'm not good, but I know you're in a hurry. And if I start to tell you how I am, and you dismiss it and take off, it would be too devastating to me." And as he looked at that man and thought about the meeting he had to get to, he made a decision right at that moment. The same decision Jesus made with Zacchaeus. He decided to stop. And he said, "Tell me how you're really doing." And the man just poured out of his heart some of the deepest hurts. And it happened to be things that Bill had gone through himself, and he understood. He was able to minister that to that man that day. He spent about 20 minutes with him in the hallway when that meeting was calling for him across the way. And he said later on, he's sure that that man would have heard hundreds of his sermons and probably would not remember any of them. But he would remember that day when he stopped and talked. When we talk about loving our neighbors and getting out of this church and going to love our neighbors, we cannot do that at 100 miles an hour. We're going to go flying past people all day long, and we're going to miss it. We're going to miss people who really are hurting, who really need your help. They need the healing touch of Jesus Christ. The only way that's going to happen is if we slow down. The only way that you're going to slow down is if you train for it. I urge you, start this week. Build in silence. Build in time alone with God, listening to God, so that when you're going through at that breakneck pace, you'll hear the voice of God tell you, slow down, stop. And you'll be able to minister to people with the love of Jesus Christ. Let's pray together.